Hi everyone, my name is Arabi and I'll be going through intergenerational trauma and its potential impact on sexual abuse survivors. We respect and value the experiences of all individuals, including the Tamil identifying diaspora across the world. For this video, I will draw upon the Tamil experience in Sri Lanka. Intergenerational trauma, also known as transgenerational trauma or historical trauma, is a term that is used to describe the impact of a traumatic experience, not only on one generation, but on subsequent generations after the event. So in other words, if an experience is traumatic, overwhelming, unresolved, or significantly impacts one's life, it can be transmitted to one's children and then their children for generations. And whilst there is no specific diagnosis of intergenerational trauma, the phenomena of intergenerational trauma is well accepted by health professionals. So experiencing trauma can lead to maladaptive ways of coping with the unresolved emotions about the event. And examples of these coping mechanisms are hypervigilance, hyperarousal, or avoidance, which may also appear as anger, panic, isolation, anxiety, or depression. And this in turn will affect relationships, especially if the trauma was relational and involved other people. This can also impact the way generations relate to each other and themselves. Because the human brain develops in direct response to the environment, the emotional responses of the parent can still affect the developing brains of their offspring. I'll now go through the migration experience of Tamils from Sri Lanka and the potential impact it can have on the Tamil diaspora, using recent research which is conducted with the Tamil community in Canada. Please note that I'll be going through some impacts of war, which may be challenging for some, so please do take care and feel free to take time away if needed. The research acknowledges the physical impact endured by the Tamil nation during the war in Sri Lanka, such as torture, rape, murder, as well as the psychological impact of the war. The research also explores experiences of the Tamil diaspora and the impact of forced migration. The participants of this research refer to the pain and suffering caused by the war as being a part of their reality and also a part of their identity. This goes on to have an impact on the migration journey and the displacement experienced as either an asylum seeker or a refugee, or potentially even as an economic migrant. Migration was a necessity for some folks rather than a choice, and this can impact how a migrant feels about their journey in a new country. Within forced migration specifically, within the context of Tamils from Sri Lanka, individuals may experience symptoms of PTSD, including hypervigilance, fear, anger, panic, depression, collective numbness, a sense of apathy, and repressed memories. The research references individuals stating that they have to be stone-hearted or thick-skinned in order to cope with war trauma. The long-term consequences of this on the Tamil diaspora in the long run, both on an individual and a collective level, is unknown, but the service providers who participated in the research reported that the Tamil community generally doesn't seek help for war trauma because they feel that they have no choice but to normalize the trauma in order to prioritize the struggles that they face in the host country, such as housing and maintaining life. Furthermore, the experiences in the host country is also very complex. Tamil migrants in the host country need to learn to adapt to a new environment. They may experience racism and have to learn to navigate language barriers. Furthermore, they may feel that the preservation of cultural identity and the Tamil language falls on them to ensure that the next generation know their roots. All of this past trauma and potentially new trauma can lead to maladaptive coping approaches, so in cases where trauma is untreated. This can include alcoholism, propensity to abuse, which includes domestic, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. The research also shows that there can be trauma related to any internal fragmentation and divisions within the Tamil community as well. So there can be a difference between how collective trauma plays out compared to individual trauma. And when we relate the relationship between first generation Tamils born in the host country and the collective trauma of the community, it can contribute towards the frictions that the first generation experience, having to navigate between multiple cultures and norms. So when we talk about collective versus individual trauma, this includes acculturation, code switching, identity confusion, challenging inherited social dynamics, such as oppression, patriarchy, class or caste structures, navigating family dynamics, such as parenting approaches, communication challenges, academic and marriage expectations. And the heaviness of having to navigate through all of this can eventually lead to some first generation Tamils experiencing depression, anxiety, approval seeking, eating disorders, and addictions. These multiple and intersecting layers of trauma mean that the trauma itself can become complicated and intertwined. For a survivor of sexual abuse or childhood sexual abuse, it can mean that sexual abuse isn't seen to be significant enough trauma, or a survivor may continue with strategies that they picked up from their parents on being stone-hearted or thick-skinned, not allowing themselves to process the impact of the sexual abuse. The survivor may not even think about disclosing to family members, particularly if the families are struggling to keep afloat, as it is, and the survivor may fear the potential impact that it could have on their family. The survivor may be living at home where it can be challenging to take steps to seek support, or perhaps seeking support from abuse may interfere with any life plans that the survivor may have. It's important to note here that there is no predictable outcome of abuse. We hear from people who have been abused on a single occasion and are struggling to cope. And we also hear from other people who have been abused many times throughout their childhood, who seem to be finding things easier to handle. We must also note that there is no hierarchy of abuse. There is no grading of which trauma is worse than the other. This is particularly relevant when we consider trauma as a consequence of war and displacement of Tamils from Sri Lanka. Individual trauma, such as rape, physical abuse, and extreme neglect, can also have long-lasting effects over generations. People who live through these events often go untreated. Most are unaware that they carry trauma or that they may pass it on to future generations. Dr. Gayani, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist, talks about the results of trauma in families where the trauma is repeated. For instance, incest is often a traumatic experience which is repeated generation after generation, she says. It becomes a horrid experience that is somehow accepted by the family because the family becomes desensitized and feels hopeless and powerless about the recurrence, and thus inadvertently enables the trauma to continue. From a CSA perspective, when we consider survivors of childhood sexual abuse within the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, we see that the abuse experienced by survivors may be compounded by the frozen trauma response of family members, peers, and the community, which may impact responses and how disclosures are handled. For instance, there can be misconceived beliefs on what's best for the survivor, such as silencing the abuse. It highlights the importance of seeing the person in their entirety when responding to abuse. So not just honing in on child sexual abuse, but considering the other trauma that the individual may be experiencing, one of which can be intergenerational trauma.